Royce Gracie, UFC 4, December 16, 1994, Denver, Colorado. Royce Gracie submits Dan Severn in a grueling 15-minute marathon that feels more like a hostage negotiation than a fight. There are no rounds, no gloves, and barely any rules. Just sweat, confusion, and a lot of human pretzels. When Severn finally taps, Royce calmly walks away undefeated, saying he's done with the chaos because, frankly, he's already proven his point. The point being, jiu-jitsu works, and also maybe we should invent weight classes. He vanishes from MMA for nearly a decade, only to return at UFC 60 against Matt Hughes, where he gets smashed like an old family VHS tape. Even Hughes later admits he felt bad halfway through the beating. Gracie's loss marks the symbolic end of pure jiu-jitsu dominance and the start of modern MMA's evolution. But he still leaves with the quiet flex of, "I started this, you're welcome." Kazushi Sakuraba. From 1999 to 2011, Kazushi Sakuraba becomes Japan's favorite chaos artist. The pro wrestler who somehow beats real fighters using arm bars, ankle locks, and pure stubbornness. He earns the nickname the Gracie Hunter after submitting Royler Gracie and then outlasting Royce Gracie in a 90-minute war at Pride Grand Prix 2000. Yes, 90 minutes. No rounds, no rest. No reason that fight should have gone that long. Gracie's corner finally throws in the towel, mostly out of mercy for everyone watching. Sakuraba then spends the next few years fighting like he's allergic to self-preservation, taking 3 brutal beatings from Wanderlei Silva that make fans question if immortality is his actual plan. By 2011, after 44 pro fights, he finally admits, "My body has limits," which might be the understatement of the century. Even the crowd seems shocked he can still walk to the mic. He retires mid-ring at Dream 17, battered but smiling, the last showman of Pride, proving you can go out on your shield and still bow with style. Ken Shamrock, one of the original UFC pioneers and the first Pancrase champion, basically invents the idea of retiring as a hobby. He calls it quits for the first time in 1996, only to unretire more often than most fighters change gyms. By 2006, he's back in the cage eating elbows from Tito Ortiz, twice, and both times the fights end in early referee stoppages that make fans riot like someone canceled The Ultimate Fighter. Shamrock swears he's done afterward, but then returns for 4 more fights, because apparently "I'm done" is just his version of "see you next year." He finally closes the book at Bellator 149 in 2016, in a bizarre trilogy fight against Royce Gracie that feels more like a family reunion gone wrong. Gracie TKOs him in round 1 after an alleged low blow that still sparks internet debates. Even the replay looks unsure what just happened. By the end, Shamrock's real legacy isn't just as a pioneer, it's as the man who proved you can retire from MMA as many times as you want, as long as someone still answers your calls. Chuck Liddell. From UFC 57 to UFC 97, Chuck Liddell is the UFC's mohawked wrecking ball, the knockout king with a right hand that turned lights off faster than the power company. But by 2010, the knockout artist becomes the one getting knocked out, losing 4 of his final 5 fights by brutal stoppage. His last bout comes against Rich Franklin at UFC 115, where Chuck dominates early but gets clipped seconds before the bell and falls like someone unplugged him. Dana White, part friend and part worried parent, officially retires him for his own safety, which is MMA code for "we like your brain too much to see it scrambled again." Chuck moves into a UFC executive role, but it lasts about as long as a Tito Ortiz takedown defense. In 2018, he returns for a trilogy fight against Tito and gets knocked out again, this time looking like he's trying to remember why he came back. Even Tito looks guilty celebrating, and that's saying something. Liddell ends his career with the perfect summary, "I don't regret anything," which is lucky because with that many knockouts, he might not remember enough to regret it anyway. Randy Couture. At a UFC 129 on April 30th, 2011, Randy Couture steps into the cage at 47 years old, basically ancient by MMA standards, to face Lyoto Machida, who's 12 years younger, empowered by karate and Red Bull. For 2 rounds, Randy tries to close the distance like a determined dad chasing a Wi-Fi signal. But Machida's too slick. Then out of nowhere, Machida lands a front kick that looks gentle in real time, but sends Couture's tooth into orbit on replay. Randy, still half smiling and missing some enamel, grabs the mic and says, "It's time to move on." The crowd gives him a standing ovation, partly for the career, partly because they're amazed he can still talk. Even Joe Rogan sounds emotional, which is rare unless DMT's involved. Couture retires with a 19-11 record, multiple titles across 2 weight classes, and a post-fight career in Hollywood action movies, proving you can lose a tooth and still land a role next to Stallone. Fedor Emelianenko. For over a decade, Fedor Emelianenko is the face of heavyweight chaos, the Russian enigma who walks into Pride rings calm as a librarian and walks out looking like he just audited someone's soul. Between 2000 and 2010, he goes unbeaten for nearly 10 years, dismantling giants like Nogueira, Krokop, and anyone else brave or unlucky enough to share a ring with him. By the time Bellator 290 rolls around on February 4th, 2023, Fedor is 46, slower, but still carrying the aura of an apex predator. Ryan Bader, half his age and twice as active, drops him with a left hand in round 1 and finishes with ground strikes, the referee stepping in before anyone can object. What happens next feels like a funeral with gloves. Legends like Randy Couture, Dan Henderson, and Chuck Liddell flood the cage to salute him. Fedor says nothing, just nods once, walks off, and retires without drama, like a man clocking out after a 20-year shift at Valhalla Incorporated. Even his silence hits harder than some fighters' highlight reels. It's the most Fedor ending imaginable, stoic, violent, and quietly mythic. Georges St-Pierre. UFC 217, November 4th, 2017. Georges St-Pierre returns after a 4-year break, looking like he's been training in a secret Canadian laboratory. He moves up to middleweight to face Michael Bisping, the loudest man in 3 time zones, and spends 3 rounds politely beating him up. Late in the fight, GSP drops him with a left hook, jumps on his back, and sinks in a rear naked choke, forcing the Brit to tap while the crowd in Madison Square Garden loses its mind. He becomes one of the few fighters in history to win titles in 2 divisions, then immediately vacates the belt weeks later after announcing he has ulcerative colitis. Only GSP could dominate a man in a cage and then retire because his stomach hurts. In February 2019, he officially retires with a 26-2 record, no scandals, and 0 bad haircuts, leaving the sport cleaner than he found it. The lesson? Even in MMA, sometimes the nice guy really does finish first, and then goes back to doing yoga in Montreal. Ronda Rousey, UFC 207, December 30th, 2016. Ronda Rousey returns after a year away, ready to reclaim her throne. The UFC markets it like a redemption arc, but Amanda Nunes clearly didn't get the memo. In just 48 seconds, Nunes turns Rousey into a human heavy bag, landing 27 unanswered strikes before Herb Dean mercifully ends the massacre. Ronda earns a record $3 million purse, which means she technically got paid about $62,000 per second to get punched in the face. There's no post-fight interview. She walks out of the cage and disappears from MMA faster than one of her judo throws. Within 18 months, she's smiling again. This time in WWE, where the punches are at least pretend. Even Joe Rogan admitted afterward, "We didn't see a comeback. We saw an exorcism." Rousey ends her career 12-2, still the first woman to headline a UFC event, and the reason every future champ, including Nunes, ever got a shot in the first place. Dan Henderson, UFC 204, October 8, 2016, Manchester, England. Dan Henderson, 46 years old and built like a retired tank mechanic, walks into his final fight for the middleweight title against Michael Bisping. The bad blood goes back years. Hendo once sent Bisping into meme history with that flying elbow at UFC 100. And the rematch feels like unfinished business. Early on, Henderson drops Bisping twice with his signature H-bomb right hand, the kind of punch that rearranges calendars. But somehow Bisping survives, bleeds all over Manchester, and rallies to win a close, unanimous decision. Hendo, ever the class act, shrugs it off saying, "That's my last dance." while the crowd gives him a hero's send-off. Even Bisping admits later, "I still feel those punches in my nightmares." Henderson retires with 47 pro fights over 20 years, a 32-15 record, and the unspoken truth that even in defeat, nobody ever really beats Dan Henderson. They just outlast the explosion. Anderson Silva. UFC Fight Night, October 31st, 2020. Anderson Silva's final walk feels less like a fight and more like the closing scene of an action movie he's been starring in since 2006. At 45, he faces Uriah Hall, a man clearly torn between throwing punches and asking for an autograph. Silva shows flashes of vintage brilliance, that calm stance, the faint smile, the little head movement that once made opponents question reality. But by round 4, Hall lands the shot that finally convinces him it's time to let the next generation handle it. The TKO marks the end of a run that included 17 straight UFC wins, clowning entire divisions, and highlight reels that aged like fine wine. Afterward, Silva thanks the crowd and simply says, "I did it my way," which feels accurate, because no one ever fought like him, and no one ever will. Even Hall hugs him like he just punched a legend by accident. A few months later, Silva joins boxing and starts beating up influencers, because apparently retirement just means switching sports. Daniel Cormier. UFC 252, August 15th, 2020. Daniel Cormier steps into the octagon for the third and final time against Stipe Miocic, hoping to end his career as heavyweight king. What he gets instead is a 5-round grind full of clinch battles, body shots, and an eye poke so bad it could have come with its own optometrist. Cormier spends half the fight squinting like he just read the bill at a Las Vegas steakhouse, but he still keeps swinging, trying to turn back time one overhand at a time. Stipe's volume and conditioning went out on the cards, earning him the trilogy and the belt. DC, always the class act, says, "No more title runs," right after confirming what everyone suspected. He's had enough of being punched in the face for a living. To be fair, he's already got 2 division belts, an Olympic resume, and a seat waiting next to Joe Rogan. He retires at 22-3 with one no contest, officially hanging up the gloves to talk about fighting instead of surviving it. Jose Aldo. UFC 278, August 20th, 2022. Jose Aldo faces Merab Dvalishvili in what turns out to be a cardio death march disguised as a fight. Merab chain wrestles like a caffeinated blender, and Aldo, once the king of knees and leg kicks, spends most of the bout defending takedowns and muttering, "Not this again," under his breath. After 3 grinding rounds, the judges hand Merab the decision, and Aldo walks off looking more relieved than angry. A few weeks later, on September 18, 2022, he officially retires with a 31-8 record, saying, "I'm at peace with it," which in fight language translates to, "I'm tired of wrestlers." Nate Diaz. UFC 279, September 10th, 2022. Nate Diaz finally headlines a card that feels like pure chaos, and naturally, he thrives in it. Originally booked to fight Khamzat Chimaev, the matchup implodes at weigh-ins, leading to the most Nate Diaz solution possible. Fight Tony Ferguson instead. After 3 rounds of Stockton taunting, casual walk-offs, and cardio that ignores logic, Nate snatches a guillotine choke in round 4 and taps Ferguson with ease. Then in peak Diaz fashion, he casually says, "I'm going to show them real fighting," as if he hadn't just shown up barefoot, smoked mid-fight week, and choked a fan favorite on live TV. With his contract up, Nate walks away 21-13, flipping the UFC double birds on his way to free agency. A month later, he's already teasing a boxing match with Jake Paul, because of course he is. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot here. I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe. Thanks for watching.